Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 39th video discussing 1950s British science fiction. In recent videos, I've been taking a detailed look at the boom in hardcover science fiction publishing, and in this final episode, we look at how it eventually died out. But did it really die? While some publishers had thrown caution to the winds and came out as unashamed purveyors of science fiction, other publishers could not quite bring themselves to overcome their long ingrained hang-up to avoid such declarations. And considering the opprobrium for the genre being generated by the lower class paperback publishers such as John Spencer, Curtis Warren and Gannett Press, etc., this was scarcely to be wondered at. But the publishers sensed there was a market for science fiction, so they were on the horns of a dilemma. The august form of Michael Joseph had been enjoying great success with John Wyndham's masterly bestseller novels, The Day of the Triffids, 1951, and The Kraken Wakes, 1953. The publisher had successfully marketed these books as mainstream novels, and whilst the blurb writers, faced with the inescapable fact that there were science fiction, it successfully disguised them by claiming them as a modified form of science fiction, something that was somehow different and better than what was unhappily known as science fiction, instead of just admitting that there were simply very good science fiction novels, as distinct from very bad ones. But given the prevailing publishing climate, this devious ploy was quite understandable, and one that Wyndham himself, having successfully shed his earlier science fiction identified John Bainan persona and reinvented himself as John Wyndham, was anxious to maintain. As a true literary craftsman, he was not happy to be identified with some of his lesser contemporaries, again understandably. But in 1955, Michael Joseph bit the bullet and launched their own distinctive science fiction series in an ingenious manner. The jackets proclaimed them to be novels of tomorrow. And what was more, they were under the general editorship of Clemence Dane, a respected literary figure. The jackets avoided the Technicolor film poster look of their rivals, but were instead issued in two-colour, small pictorial designs and just a couple of full pictorial or billboard covers. The books were higher priced than most at 9 and 6. What was the price? At 9 and 6. Possibly indicating that they paid higher advances for their superior material. It was not just a cynical ploy, but a determined and sincere attempt to advance British science fiction publishing. Top American authors, such as Robert Sheckley, Untouched by Human Hands, 1955, appeared alongside British talent like John Bolland. And there was Arthur Sellings, Arthur Lee, and most notably John Christopher. Sam Youde. Christopher's first science fiction book, The 22nd Century, it appeared from Grayson and Grayson in 1954, but Michael Joseph secured his follow-up novel, Year of the Comet. The author then shot to international fame and fortune with his next Joseph title, The Death of Grass, which many people hailed as reading like John Wyndham, only better. John Wyndham himself continued to write his masterly bestsellers, such as The Chrysalids, 1955, and whilst this book was seemingly integrated into the Novels of Tomorrow series by being advertised as part of it on the back of the other book's jackets, the blurbs of which were now incautiously referring to some of their authors as science fiction writers, this label was conspicuously missing from Wyndham's own books, including his 1956 collection, The Seeds of Time. Although the Dane series was advertised on the inside back flap, you see there. Now, other quality writers included Wilson Tucker, Shepherd Mead, C.M. Cornbluth, John Mantley, whose book The 27th Day was later filmed, and William Tenn, famous American writer. Joseph's commendable series began in February 1955 and was successful enough to outlast all of their competitors, running through to 1957 when it was quietly dropped with Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human. But they continued to successfully publish John Wyndham's new novels on their own merits throughout the 1960s. The other quality hardcover publisher to emerge towards the end of the boom was Faber and Faber. Bruce Montgomery, under his famous detective novel pseudonym of Edmund Crispin, published Best SF in 1955, the first in a series of annual anthologies. Best SF2 followed in 1956, and the series would run for over 10 years. Despite its hefty price tag of 15 shillings, despite that high price and the fact that nearly all of the mostly American stories were drawn from already anthologized stories that had already appeared in the UK, the books were well received owing to their undoubted quality. Faber's titles were not really part of the boom, the publisher wisely deciding to simply go their own way, and as a result they were able to attract some of the best emerging new British writers who, whilst always writing within the science fiction genre, sought to improve upon it. These better writers would only emerge in the late 50s, after the boom and bust was over, and they would continue their careers in the decades that followed. The most important such writer was Brian W. Aldiss, whose collection Space-Time and Nathaniel Faber published in 1957, his first science fiction book in a long series of outstanding titles. But these later developments are outside the time frame of these videos, but they've been well documented elsewhere. Aldiss was preceded on the Faber list in 1956 by the American writer James Blish, whose books Earthman Come Home and They Shall Have Stars were warmly reviewed by Brian Aldiss in his influential review column in the Oxford Mail. Building on this platform, Blish would never look back, although his earlier Nova paperback, Jack of Eagles, it sank without trace, as I revealed in an earlier video. Considering the general high quality of the majority of the hardcover titles, it's difficult to pinpoint why the early 1950s hardcover boom came to a sudden end. It must have been a combination of several complex factors. The opprobrium against science fiction that had been generated by the mushroom paperbacks had peaked in 1953, but by 1955 the boom had all but died out. The one notable exception was the Science Fiction Book Club, which, with its lower overheads, continued with regular monthly selections for almost 3 decades, dying only when the new publisher lost interest. So, what had caused the great hardcover science fiction extinction by 1956? I've already touched on this in an earlier video, but these points deserve restating. Quite possibly part of the answer lay in the gradual slump in the use of circulating libraries, which for many years had been the main purchasers of hardcover genre fiction. These were situated all over the country, not only in the big chains like Booth's famous circulating library, but in many high street newsagents and small shops. With the easing of paper rationing, and the vast increase in the amount of respectable paperback fiction becoming readily available from bookshops and other outlets, and the advent of commercial television providing genre entertainments, people simply ceased to use these lending libraries. Another possible factor was the preponderance of American anthologies, all of them very much alike and with the same coterie of authors. The opportunity to encourage the better British authors to raise their game from the mushroom publishers was mostly missed. Yet another, more prosaic explanation is that publishers may simply have found that the science fiction lines did not provide as much profit as their other genre staples, detective stories and westerns. Science fiction publishing involved more trouble and expense than these longer established genres. The need to employ outside editors and consultants to ensure quality, specialist cover artists, and possibly higher rates to reflect the fact that 2 agent fees had to be met for imported American material. If these extra cost factors were not reflected in extra sales over and above their other genre products, then it simply wasn't worth the candle. But the mini boom in science fiction hardcovers, whilst appearing to end in failure, actually sowed the seeds from which a vigorous British science fiction publishing industry was to spring up out of the dunghill of the mushroom publishers. For within a dozen years, the majority of these titles were very successfully reissued, reprinted in paperback as part of a steady presentation of science fiction by all the major publishers that has continued ever since. The signs and portents for this later success were already apparent in the 1950s as the larger and more successful paperback publishers the more successful paperback publishers began to assert themselves with the easing of paper supplies. They all of them began to include a smattering of science fiction in their lists. Now, Pan Books had always issued a few classic science fiction books, such as The Doomsday Man by J.B. Priestley, H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, and C.S. Lewis's Professor Ransom trilogy. You see there. Then, in 1954, they reprinted Charles Eric Main's Spaceways with a Gerard Quinn cover. They would follow it with a flood of titles, mainly reprinted from Sidgwick and Jackson's strong hardcover science fiction lists, such as Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. This 1956 edition is a collector's item because they omitted his middle initial on the cover, saying it was by Arthur Clarke instead of Arthur C. Clarke. Now, since the 1930s, Penguin Books had always published a fair number of more literary fantasies, such as J.D. Beresford's The Camberwell Miracle. But the big science fiction breakthrough came in 1954, when they reprinted John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids, followed by The Crock and Wakes. Look. Crock and Wakes. That was the following year, and the founder is sold as well as did Agatha Christie. The most enterprising UK publisher in both quality and quantity of science fiction titles was Corgi Books, published by Transworld. Up until the mid-1950s, most of their books were identical to the American editions of Bantam Books, with whom they were initially tied. Between 1952 and 1956, they issued a dozen top-class science fiction titles by the likes of Frederick Brown, Kurt Siodmak, that was also a famous film, Donovan's Brain, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Edmund Hamilton, Richard Matheson and others. Their film tie-in, which you see at the end there, The Forbidden Planet, is today a prime collectible. Their art editor and chief cover artist was the talented John Richards. They would go on over the following decades to be one of the most consistent science fiction publishers, along with Panther Books and others. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my survey of how science fiction became established in the UK. It just remains for me to thank those of you who've responded to my earlier videos, in particular number 21, in which I showed the pages of my teenage comic strip adaptation of Across the Ages by Volgo Staten. I followed up on a suggestion made by some of my respondents to have it scanned and published as a paperback graphic novel, as you can see here. It's now available to buy on lulu.com. A4 size, 40 pages in full colour. Just have a quick look at it. Oops. I want to pay particular tribute to Richard King and David Whitehead, who helped me with the book. And yeah, it's been reproduced very well in full colour. Just a few of the pages which you've already seen in my earlier video. Those of you who saw video 21. I won't mention the storyline because I've already detailed it in my earlier videos. The artwork gets a bit better towards the end, as you've probably noticed, as it was quite a bit older. It took me a few years to finish it, but finish it I did. If anyone was interested, it's available to buy on lulu.com at £9. But if anyone contacts me directly, I have a few autographed copies I'd be pleased to send. Now, I don't know if anyone may be interested in learning about my other comic strip collaborations with artist Ron Turner, or any other aspects of the 1950s which I haven't already covered, including currently available and forthcoming reprints from such authors as E.C. Tubb, whose classic story Lucifer is now being filmed as 52nd Seconds, starring Morgan Freeman. So, if you'd like any further videos, let me know. Until such time, I'll say thank you and goodbye.